Greetings and welcome to our final session on confronting evil in history. Today we're turning to this, I think, very interesting book by Glover on humanity. And Glover's central question is really the central question that we've been grappling with. What are the moral resources which we have as human beings that support us in decent behavior and possibly make the likelihood or the possibility of evil behavior less likely? So Glover asks the fundamental question: what are the moral resources that we have as human beings, which we can draw upon as a support for decent behavior, both on our own part and also on the part of others? What motives, emotions, and ways of thinking are available to us as human beings that contribute to treating people with care and consideration, what we might call benevolence, and treating people as we would want to be treated, what we might call fairness? And then how can these moral resources prevent cruelty, murder, and enslavement of the kind that we've seen throughout the course of the 20th century? Here's a quote about the moral emotions, which I think is a good place to begin in discussing Glover's book. We have distinctive psychological responses to different things people do. Acts of cruelty may arouse our revulsion. We may respond to some mean swindle with contempt. Courage or generosity may win our respect or admiration. These responses to others are linked to our sense of our own moral identity. Many people have their own, often very un-Nietzschean, projects of self-creation. We have a conception of what we are like and of the kind of person we want to be, which may limit what we are prepared to do to others. I think that's a very profound statement. But we can also ask, how did we get here? How could we have a moral conception of ourselves? How can we have this idea of certain moral emotions which lead us to refrain from kinds of behavior which are distasteful? And we've mentioned two different theories, and they're kind of complementary theories. One is an evolutionary statement, the fact that human beings are social hominids. We evolved our central nervous systems and our basic cognitive and practical and emotional capacities as social beings, which favored a social psychology of caring and cooperating. And we can kind of go into, or philosophers and biologists can go into what that means. But we also have a cultural history extending over 5,000 or 10,000 years as social human beings living in families, communities, and states. And through that cultural history, we have created and have crafted sets of values and adherences and commitments which have served to help guide us in our conceptions of ourselves and in our actions. You might say that all of this is very contingent. We had a specific biological history, we have a specific cultural history, very contingent, and therefore it is perhaps just good fortune that we are human beings rather than Klingons or Nietzschean egoistic super beings. Instead, we are human beings capable of compassion and an impulse towards living together peacefully and justly. We have, in fact, constituted ourselves, at least in part, to respect the dignity of other human beings. This is one of the values, the fundamental values of so many strands of human culture, not one religious tradition, not one moral tradition, but many traditions of human culture, a respect for the dignity of other human beings. And I would put this forward, and I think Glover puts it forward, as a cultural attainment. It is not universal. We have seen this again and again in the course. Nazis did not respect the dignity of other human beings. Glover, in fact, connects respect for the dignity of others with an unwillingness to murder others. If we have this respect for the dignity of others, we will be less likely to be willing to murder other human beings. Here are a couple of quotes that I think are valuable from Glover. Respect and sympathy are human responses, which human beings do not always have. Our frequent inhumanity is the theme of this book, but it contrasts with these widespread and deep-rooted responses, which are part of our humanity. Someone decent to other people merely out of self-interested calculation, with no independent inclination towards respect or sympathy, could be said to lack humanity. The psychopath who has simply learned to behave as if he or she had respect for other people, that person lacks humanity, according to Glover. Returning to the Glover quote, human responses are the core of the humanity which contrasts with inhumanity. They are widely distributed, but to identify them with humanity is only partly an empirical claim. It remains also an aspiration. It's something that we aspire to. We want to be a kind of being which has compassion, has caring, has an ability to identify with other human beings. Another valuable quote from Glover, respect for someone's dignity is an affirmation of a fundamental human equality. You may be richer and more powerful than me, and from a different ethnic group or religion, but if you treat me with courtesy and respect, you signal your recognition of my status, that I am as much a person as you are. If, when we meet, you listen as well as talk, you acknowledge that I too have experiences, thoughts, and a way of seeing the world, that I too may have something to say worth hearing, that is what it is to recognize the fundamental equality of human beings. Continuing, another important quote from another part of the book, one is the tendency to respond to people with certain kinds of respect. This may be bound up with ideas about their dignity or about their having a certain status, either as members of our community or just as fellow human beings. The other human response is sympathy, caring about the miseries and the happiness of others, and perhaps feeling a degree of identification with them. So what Glover is highlighting here is respect and fellow feeling, having a concern for the equal dignity which all human beings have. Another factor which Glover pays a lot of attention to is the question, what are the sources of evil in the 20th century, but in the 8th century as well? And one source which he produces, which he identifies and singles out for careful inspection, is ideology, master ideologies. And the example that he offers is in detail is Stalinism, though we might also consider Nazism under the same rubric. But Stalinism was the idea, the single-minded idea that the success of Soviet communism is the highest good, it is the only good, that any sacrifice is justified, those who interfere must be destroyed, those whose sacrifice may aid in the achievement of communism must be destroyed. So this ideology places the successful achievement of communist society in the Soviet Union as the highest good to which everything else can be sacrificed. Though I would also want to underline that Stalin was also a master political criminal, focused on extending and maintaining his own absolute power, the power of his state, and entirely ruthless in using violence and terror to extend his power. So ideology was a tool for Stalin, but it is not the whole explanation of his evil. Sometimes people think that Stalin was the evil origin of the bad actions of the Soviet state, but actually Lenin himself had some of the same ideological conviction that any sacrifice was justified on the basis of achieving communism. Quoting from Glover, there was indifference to the individual people who might be destroyed by the new policies, the policies of communism. This view came from Lenin, who had written in 1908 that the Paris Commune had failed because of the, quote, excessive generosity of the proletariat, who, quote, should have exterminated its enemies instead of trying, quote, to exert moral influence on them. In 1917, when Lenin opposed the abolition of capital punishment for deserters at the front, Trotsky quoted him as saying, "Nonsense. How can you make a revolution without executions? It is a mistake, impermissible weakness, pacifist illusion," and so on. In other words, there was a murderous and cold brutality built into Soviet-style communism and ideology from the very start. There's a metaphor which became common in the 1940s, and which is, to me, a completely chilling metaphor. If you want to make an omelet, you must scramble eggs. But here's the history of that saying. It is a saying which is intended to justify atrocities for the sake of the greater good of achieving some ideologically defined end state. Quoting now from the book, one phrase caught the individual's unimportance relative to the great project and was spread around the world by an American journalist, Walter Duranty, an admirer of Stalin, who reported for the New York Times. In 1932, he published in the paper a poem called Red Square, which included the lines, Russians may be hungry and short of clothes and comfort, but you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. The first use of the phrase was used only to justify shortages. Duranty, later trying to discredit reports of mass starvation in the terror famine, wrote, "To put it brutally, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs." This phrase was used to justify Stalin's supporters in the most brutal and violent actions of the Soviet state, and it is overall horrific. A goal of the Stalinist state, but also a goal of the Hitler state, the Nazi state, was to extinguish the moral resources which Glover has highlighted as being the source of decency and humanity. He argues that much of the propaganda, the language, and the behavior of the Soviet state was designed to destroy the moral instincts of ordinary Soviet citizens. It involved erosion of respect, referring to people as parasites, as filthy dogs, as reptiles, and as kulaks. This is a kind of moral education, but it is a degenerate moral education. It is the creation of new Soviet man, and it has an exact parallel that we've already seen with Nazi propaganda and behavior. Another point which I think we've now come to see in our study of evil is the evil of silence. This is a quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the book Gulag Archipelago. The mildest and at the same time the most widespread form of betrayal was not to do anything bad directly, but just not to notice the doomed person next to one, not to help him, to turn away one's face, to shrink back. They had arrested a neighbor, your comrade at work, or even your close friend. You kept silent. You acted as if you had not noticed. This keeping silent is a part of the evil of a totalitarian state. And ideologies have great power on human thinking and human emotion. Glover takes the case of the British Communist Party and its extreme dogmatism before the outbreak of World War II and then during World War II. There was a fixed point that the Soviet Union deserves our unconditional loyalty. There was also the view that liberal democracy is a sham and that in fact it is the same as fascism. And then there was a willingness to reconcile with the Hitler-Stalin pact. These points of kind of fixed points in the ideological spectrum led advocates and activists and leaders of the British Communist Party and the French Communist Party and communist parties all over the world, really, to defend the indefensible. And Glover believes that the power which permitted that was the power of ideology. In this context, I think of George Orwell, and Glover also thinks of George Orwell, because Orwell was a progressive, he was a leftist. In some ways, he identified with the non-Stalinist communist left, but he also had the courage and vision to look clearly at the crimes of Stalinism and to denounce them for what they are. He saw that propaganda and faith in an ideology drives atrocity. His book about the Spanish Civil War and the lies which were told in and about the Spanish Civil War and the role of the Soviet communists in Spain it's a wonderful book to read, Homage to Catalonia. But he makes the point that lies are some of the most powerful tools of totalitarianism. And he offers a commitment to trying to see and express the truth, and that this is one of the moral resources which constitutes our humanity. If we can remain honest and committed to the idea of seeing the facts as they are, not as an ideology which someone is trying to force upon us would have them, that is what it is to be a decent human being. Stalin's attack on humanity, another valuable quote, human responses to other people. This is what happened in the 1930s and 40s in the Soviet Union. Human responses to other people, the responses of respect and sympathy, are the heart of our humanity. That's Glover's central point. I concur with this. Under Stalinism, the human responses were repressed on instrumental grounds. With extreme implausibility, this repression of people's humanity was claimed to be the route to a more humane world. Repression of humanity leads to a more humane world. In Nazi Germany, the demand that the young should be violent, domineering, and cruel was not merely instrumental. The attack on people's humanity was carried out partly for its own sake. So totalitarianism is, in a very important sense, incompatible with humanism and with the value of humanity. Its goal is to destroy kindness, compassion, independent thought, courage, and sympathy, and to do this as a means to an end, but also as an end in itself, to create Nazi man or Soviet man. So Glover summarizes his findings in a couple of ideas. One is the importance of history in being a full and fully awake human being. This book would not have been written without the belief that the past is alive in the present. And I would like to ask you, what do you think this means? Perhaps it means that we are different human beings today because of historical events and traumas that occurred decades or centuries ago, that history changes us as human beings, that humanity is different as a result of our history, which has been one of the central thrusts of this course. We as human beings and as embodiments of versions of humanity, we have crafted our responses to the atrocities of the past. Now, quoting again from Glover, keeping the past alive may help to prevent atrocities. There can be terrible significance in what people expect others to forget. If we're asked to forget the atrocities against the Croatian Muslims, that is a terrible thing, not only because those people deserve our remembrance, but also because it makes it much more feasible for atrocities like that to occur in the future. Quoting, 20th century wars, massacres, and genocides come from combining this psychology with modern technology. Without Sarajevo, without Stalin or Hitler, it seems likely that the destructive technology would still have been developed and used. He's talking about gas chambers and weapons of mass destruction and mass warfare. But this was a place where I'm not persuaded by Glover. This seems too simple because it wasn't technology, but political innovations that created the 20th century. It was the creation of totalitarianism and of Nazi ideology and of Soviet extremism, ideologies and state apparatuses of total control and total power, the total diminishment of humanity and the diminishment of individual human beings. So maybe a better coda for this important book about humanity, but also a better coda for our course as well, is to look at the evils of the past with our eyes open, to maintain and extend our individual humanity, to be human beings with benevolence and fairness towards others, to resist totalizing ideologies and movements, as Orwell resisted the totalizing ideology of Stalinism, to resist totalitarian dictatorship. That's a hard thing to imagine, because totalitarian governments have vast power, but totalitarian governments also create vast evil. And so resisting totalitarianism is perhaps heroic, but also hugely important. To prevent totalitarianism by struggling for constitutional, liberal, democratic political systems. And why liberal, democratic political systems? Because they embody respect for human equality, dignity, and liberties. There is a meaningful reason why liberal democracy is inherently superior to dictatorship and to the totalizing systems of the 20th century. And that superiority has to do with the fundamental commitment that liberal democracies make to human equality, the dignity of the individual, and the liberties and the value of the happiness of the individual. Another coda for how to prevent evil in the future: to maintain political systems that avoid excessive concentration of power in a single party or a single leader. Pluralism is an important way of fending off evil activities by a state. And then finally, I think we've kind of seen in numerous instances, whether it's in Croatia or possibly today in China and the Uyghurs, the importance of international institutions which have some ability to restrain warfare and crimes against humanity. These are all limited options for preventing evil in the future, but that's the best we have: to be a decent human being, to be a part of a civil society, a democratic society, which is committed to the values of equality and the equal worth of all citizens, and then to struggle to keep those institutions intact. I would like to thank you for a wonderful semester. I've come to have a lot of respect for each of you and what you've contributed to the course, but also what you've learned from the honors program. It's been a pleasure being together throughout this course.